The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
It's called And Every Word is True. And now that is a play on words from Truman Capote. And the book is by Gary McAvoy. And let's start right in. How are you doing, Gary?
Great, Al. Thanks. It's super to be with you today.
Well, we're not there yet, so we'll see how you feel in a while.
If you hear a click, you'll know how well it's going.
I've had that before, and it's all good. So let's talk about you first. Let's talk about how you got into this story and how you found the documents to write this book.
Sure. Well, I've been a dealer of rare literary manuscripts and first edition books for some 25 years or so. And in 2012, I was approached by a client named Ron Nye. Ron was the son of Harold Nye, who was the lead and field investigator for the Herbert Clutter family murders that took place in Garden City, Kansas in November of 1959. Truman Capote, the author of In Cold Blood, had sent letters and signed books to Agent Nye while Capote was working on his book in Spain. And Ron and I decided to mount a special auction for these materials, which included his father's investigation notes and in 2 spiral-bound notebooks, and a passel of other documents, official KBI reports, crime scene photographs, and various notes. Now, when the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, or KBI, heard about the pending sale, they issued a cease and desist, which soon turned into a lawsuit, which sought to prevent us from selling or publicizing the materials. But after a grueling 4-year court battle, we ultimately won, and that's how the book came to be.
Now, did you have a particular interest when were you a fan of Capote? Were you a fan of the book, the movie? Did you have some sort of a personal, like you were aware of everything already?
Well, true crime is not a particularly strong genre for me. In fact, I think the first time I'd read In Cold Blood was when it was published, 1966, 67 maybe. And like many people who read it around the world, I was gripped by its narrative and moved by the crimes itself. But as a true crime, I wouldn't call myself a true crime devotee. But when these materials landed in my lap, I knew I had something here that I could wrap my hands around. And of course, the lawsuit coming up kind of compelled me to take things further than I'd originally planned.
I wonder, the lawsuit in itself, such a big ordeal, and I guess you could never really come to a conclusion as to why it was such a big deal. Obviously, but how was that to deal with? Or was there times when you were going through that 4-year term that you wanted to maybe drop out or bail?
No, not at all. No, I was going to fight, and Ron Nye was of the same mind. The state claims to have based their case on the fact that Harold Nye was an employee of the KBI at the time the notebooks were created, thus making them state property. But Nye had a lifelong habit of using these spiral-bound reporter's notebooks we've all seen, which are not so much of a diary as an ongoing journal of things in his life. And this was long before he joined the KBI, and this was our position defending ourselves in the lawsuit. Now, the court ultimately ruled that Nye's notebooks were essentially a collection of facts, personal impressions, and to-do lists, things like that, concerning his investigation of the Clutter murders, and that the creation of these were deemed speech within the meaning of the First Amendment, and that's what it boiled down to in the end.
I would imagine that when you first got them, were you really interested as in the content, or did the lawsuit make you kind of get more detail?
Very good question. No, I had little interest in the minutia of all the reports, the investigative documents. The crime scene photos were just grisly and very difficult to look at. But I just wanted to mount a simple auction, and Ron had family medical needs, expenses that he needed to cover, and that's the only reason. Ron's mother, Joyce, was when Harold Nye died in 2003. Joyce was cleaning out the house that her family had lived in for some 30 years. And Harold Nye was a legendary keeper of stuff, including 15 banker's boxes of his investigation reports and these spiral-bound notebooks I mentioned. And he stored most of these in the attic. Well, after Harold died, Joyce decided to clean house and had all 15 boxes shredded professionally. And that was that. But once he was cleaning out the house and packing things up, Ron came over one day to decide to help her. And as he parked his car and started in toward the house, he looked in the trash bins and noticed that there were two books by Truman Capote. One was the first edition of In Cold Blood, signed not only by Truman, but by all the principal investigators of the Clutter murder, and the director and cast, rather crew and cast of the 1967 movie In Cold Blood. So Ron plucked these out of the trash and put them in his car, and then went in to help his mom pack up. Well, some years later, Ron discovered that his ex-wife was living in assisted housing, and this was the love of his life. And even though they divorced, he was always held this love for her. And when he found her living in assisted housing, decided that he would move her in and take care of her expenses. But as those expenses grew, he needed to find more ways of making money to accommodate those. He recalled that the books and letters, two letters that Truman had written to Agent Nye while he was writing In Cold Blood in Spain, those two books and the two letters, Ron reasoned, had some value. So he contacted a couple auction houses to see if there was any value there. And Christie's out of New York was intrigued by the materials, but it's not something they normally handle. So they recommended Ron give me a call. And when I saw the materials, I had him send everything to me to validate it. The provenance was there. The value was clearly there. And as I was going through the materials, I knew that the books and letters had collectible value, but I wasn't so sure about the rest of the documents. They just seemed ancillary to the auction, and that's how I posed the auction, with the principal pieces being the books and letters, and the other material having this historical association, as we call it. That's when the KBI discovered that we were selling original, copies of the official reports, and they didn't know what was in Harold Nye's notebooks, so they didn't want to take the risk that, in their view, that there may have been investigation methods or privacy issues at stake, even though the case was well over 50 years closed and solved. So that's a little background as to how the auction came to be.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. These sort of things are cool. One thing that comes to my mind is, I wonder how, maybe you would know, how did Ron Nye and his mother and family feel about Capote's book? I mean, if she's just throwing it away and it's signed, the value of the book you could sell.
It was just another book.
Yeah. But you could.
Yeah, well, I actually don't think Joyce, Mrs. Nye, had read the book. We all know the story of Harold Nye throwing it across the room, calling it a fiction when he read it. I do happen to know that he did finish the book, because in that copy that Ron had sent me was a list of page references that Harold had made notes about. And so he did get through the entire book eventually.
What was the biggest objection, do you think? And knowing Ron, like you've met him and you've spent time with him, obviously, what do you think the biggest objection to Capote's version is?
Well, I know that Harold Nye was uncomfortable with the way the clutters were described, and I can't explain anything beyond that because, of course, Harold's passed away now.
Right.
And we don't know what specifics that he found in the book that caused him so much grief. Now, for years, he had asked Ron to help him write a book about his story of the investigation. And Ron is convinced that his father knew a great deal more than was told by Capote in Cold Blood. And very likely it had to do with some of the material that I've pulled out of his notes and files and put into my book.
Yeah. So now, what was your impression of Ron Nye when you met him? And
salt of the earth.
Yeah.
Ron's hobby is hot rods, and he had one that actually plays a role in the book named Godzilla. So he tinkers on hot rods, and he's been married three times, and has children and grandchildren, and is now retired, living in Oklahoma City, still caring for his ex-wife, and yeah, he's just a great guy, real gentle spirit.
How so now
with an eidetic memory. If I would go so far to say a photographic memory, he never forgets a thing. I interviewed him for well over 6 years in the making of this book, and the richness of his stories that I was able to extract from him were just a writer's dream, frankly.
Yeah, he was on your audio book as well.
Yes.
I noticed that he did his parts and stuff. How does he feel now that this book is out, and he did the foreword, I believe, or part of it, and how's he feeling now? Does he feel like the story's more complete?
His greatest concern, Al, was that the state had tarnished the Nye family name by calling his father a thief. To both of us, but to Ron in particular, this was one of the most disturbing aspects of the lawsuit, that the state would go so far as to call Harold Nye a thief for misappropriating state records. What all he did was took home personal copies of his own case files, which, by the way, was entirely permissible by statute at the time. The Nye family has a long and proud tradition of being one of the founding families of Kansas and Oklahoma. And those win at any cost tactics employed by the Attorney General were just below the belt and greatly agitated Ron and his family. Fortunately, the court made it clear when it ruled in our favor that Nye had done nothing wrong, and that was some consolation.
Yeah, I just wonder why they got so, just downright mean, I guess is the best way to put it. Why they would say something so nasty about the family like that. Why? I mean, obviously they were in attack mode. This is something they wanted real bad. But
yeah, I've been asked many times what Kansas's motivation was, and it's still a mystery to us, even to both our attorneys here in Seattle and our attorney in Kansas. They were mystified the entire 4 years as to why Kansas was putting such an aggressive posture behind their lawsuit. They never explained it. We couldn't fathom it. So I just went on about my business.
Yeah. It's just you're never going to know unless they come out and say why, particularly the whole. So now, what was the biggest surprise for you going through his notes? What shocked you the most?
Actually, as I mentioned, I had not read much of Nye's case materials at all in those early days. It was 2012 at the time. Nor had I looked inside Nye's notebooks, for that matter, since all we were doing was mounting a simple auction of books and letters to help defray Ron's medical expenses. But when the specter of a lawsuit appeared, I had to learn as much of these materials as I could to explain to the court what was actually happening. But in digging deeper, I found a number of significant differences between what Capote had written in cold blood and in the documents I was holding in my hands. For example, there was an informer in the Kansas State Penitentiary by the name of Floyd Wells, who had been a cellmate of one of the Clutter killers, Richard Hickock. Now, Wells was the linchpin to both the crimes and the investigation. And while sharing the same cell at KSP, Wells had convinced Hickock that he had once worked for a rich farmer out west by the name of Herb Clutter, who kept a safe containing $10,000, and it would be an easy score to pull off. Hickock claims Wells gave him a map to the Clutter's farm and a diagram of the house, showing such details as where the office was and which bedrooms the family slept in. But the fact is, Wells only worked for Clutter as a ranch hand for some 7 months, and he left his employment before the house had even been completed, so Wells could not have known anything about it. Yet someone provided that diagram for Hickock. So Hickock makes plans to rob the Clutters when he got out of prison about a month later and told Wells he would cut him in for a share of the score. But there was no safe, there was no $10,000, and when Smith and Hickock hit the Clutter house on November 15th, 1959, they murdered the entire family after finding less than $50. There was another important distinction I discovered in the notebooks, that there's a scene in Cold Blood and in the movie where Harold Nye, alone at the Hickock farm, is interviewing Hickock's father, Walter, and he spots the murder weapons, a shotgun and a knife. But he does nothing at the time. Now, Capote reports this as happening 5 days before it actually occurred in truth. And then Nye was accompanied by several other agents with a formal search warrant. The reason for this delay was that Alvin Dewey had long believed it was a grudge killing, and as a result didn't give any credence at all to Floyd Wells' claim that Hickock and Smith were to blame, and it was just a robbery. It's a pretty important detail to have gotten wrong or misinterpreted. But it sure made for a dramatic scene in the book and in the 1967 film.
Yeah, and after all, that's what's important.
That's right.
It's got to be the dramatic.
Who cares
scene.
About the facts?
Yeah, we got to make it catch you, and that leads me to the like I know this, and the name of the book. Maybe review that a little bit so people know why you called it "And Every Word Is True."
Sure. Well, Capote had long claimed that his book was, the two words that spring to mind are immaculately factual. And even as early as 1966, within months after the book coming out, many reviewers were taking potshots at it as being, as parts of it being untrue. But I think it was 1967, Capote was being interviewed by Karen Gunderson, a reporter at Newsweek. And in it, he gave her a fantastic quote. He said, "My book is about the Clutters, who were the four Clutters who were murdered on November 15th, and Richard Hickock and Perry Smith, who were hanged April 14th, 1965. My book is about their lives and their deaths, and every word is true." And I looked at that and I said, "This is perfect. There's irony. There's the belief that his book was true, when in fact, not just what I found, but many have in the past 50-some years, there are many errors and omissions that the book gets blamed for. My book is not a takedown of Capote or In Cold Blood by any means. It simply adds rich supplement to the material that he's provided, and gives it, I think, a fairer balance of the investigation, since Capote clearly favored Alvin Dewey as his protagonist, when in fact Harold Nye did the majority of the legwork.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. You think that you think Capote himself felt his book was really that accurate, like that true to events, or do you think he was just so caught up he wouldn't know?
I suspect that he knew that he was creating a work of, well, as he put it, a nonfiction novel. A novel is, by definition, based on fictive devices. So he blended the fiction that he used to provide dialogue for the Clutter family, for example, or the final scene where Alvin Dewey is in the graveyard with one of the other principals. Those did not happen. He clearly acknowledged that at the end, even though he said that the book is all factually accurate.
Well, and I understand is that from a writer, sometimes you have to do some of your own fill-in. Otherwise, there's a lot of blanks. Sometimes you can't get all the information.
Right.
You know,
and I think he acknowledged that. I really do. If he simply hadn't used the words immaculately factual, he would have taken far less heat.
Yeah. It's just interesting. Some of the things stick out for me for some reason. When you were talking about Cherokee Indian and some of what he claimed in his book about particular people like that.
Right.
I just wonder where if he knew the true information, if he just tried to make it one way or another. Same as about
just to clarify that point for your listeners. Capote defined Perry Smith as being Cherokee, when in fact his family was Northern Paiute, Western Shoshone, which is in no way connected to the Cherokee tribe. And though we have no idea why he used Cherokee, I surmise that it's because the Cherokee, the Navajo, and I can't remember the third right now, but the three largest tribes in North America are most commonly used, most likely because of the American television and movies. The Cherokees and Navajos were more widely known. Sioux.
Yeah.
Sioux is the third tribe.
He was very convinced that, I guess it was not Hitchcock, but Perry that killed all four members of the Clutter family, when we really don't know.
We don't know, except that Perry in several... I also have, and as I think I've alluded to in the book, have Perry Smith's personal journals that he left Wendell and Josephine Meyer, the undersheriff of Garden City, on his way to the gallows. And in it, Perry clearly acknowledges that he killed all four Clutters with his own hands. Even though I read these words in his writing, I still have no idea whether that was true or if he's taking the guilt on from the crimes, which seems to be in his nature.
Yeah, it's such a complex case, really.
Very much so.
So now, did you get? This is a tough. Did you get what you expected to get out of the book?
I got more. Capote once said that he only used 20% of all the research he had in working on In Cold Blood. I feel much the same. There's so much more that I could have put in, and I couldn't make it work. and and without going into, as we discussed earlier, the conspiracy theory zone, which I worked very hard to stay away from. But I mean, just that meeting in Cimarron alone. Let me touch on that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And in the Hickock letters. Well, after the killers, Perry Smith and Richard Hickock were apprehended and awaiting execution on death row. A reporter for the Wichita Eagle, with the memorable name of Startling Machinations, had met Hickock, and the two decided to work on a book together in which Hickock would tell his inside story of the murders and both killers' flight from justice. So over the next year or so, Hickock wrote hundreds of pages of letters to Machinations, which would ultimately form a book titled High Road to Hell, which never got published, but that was Nations' goal. And it's described these letters described in spectacular detail every element of the crime and where they fled afterwards to Mexico, to California, then cross country all the way down to Florida, Miami. Everything Hickock had written conforms to what the killers have said in their interrogations, with the exception of some pretty shocking disclosures, which he includes. Specifically, that he and Smith were planning to meet up with someone named Roberts after the murders to collect $5,000. He also mentioned things like, well, while they were in the Clutter home, they had to tear up the place to make it look like a robbery, and other statements which clearly, to my mind, alluded to a murder for hire. Now, Hickock was on death row at the time, as I said, with no apparent need to lie or embellish on a story that, by that time, had been pretty well known. But in Harold Nye's notebooks, he describes an interview with the night marshal in the nearby cowboy town, Cimarron, Kansas, which happened just a couple hours after the murders, in which three suspicious men entered a cafe, two of them resembling Smith and Hickock, down to Perry's limping leg and Hickock's scarred face, and they were in the presence of a third unknown figure. Now, I believe this might have been this Roberts character. Two, they were also driving a car identical to the one the killers were driving, a 1956 Chevy, and they appeared nervous in the presence of the marshal and left the cafe before the food they ordered was ready to go. It's all very suspicious. But I imagine during the investigation, further connections to the Clutter murders just weren't made at the time. But perhaps most relevant, and up to now completely unknown, part of the Clutter investigation was an incredibly important detail that the case coordinator, Alvin Dewey, had neglected to make known to anyone else, that there was evidence of Mr. Clutter having an affair with the wife of his business partner. And now Mrs. Clutter had been under psychiatric care for years and was diagnosed with depression and physical malaise and nervousness. She even slept in a separate bedroom and relied on her daughter, Nancy, and the housekeeper to attend to domestic duties. But credible eyewitness reports place Clutter and his paramour at a co-op dance in Wichita without each other's spouses in attendance. And after the dance, they headed upstairs in the hotel elevator. Now, Dewey and Clutter were close friends. And given the small-town dynamics of the time, it's just not surprising he tried to keep this information from getting out. But official reports tell a pretty compelling story. And with new questions arising as to what the real motive was for the crimes in the first place. And you recall reading, by the way, that in his final days, Mr. Clutter was described as being angry and having unusual frustrations, and apparently taken up smoking, a vice so repugnant he wouldn't hire anyone who smoked or drank. And as is well known to readers of In Cold Blood, on the morning of his death, had taken out a life insurance policy that he'd been planning to do for at least 2 years. So the breadth and depth of the material I had to work on for this book was absolutely overwhelming. One reason it took 7 years to complete.
Yeah. Well, that's it. You know, you get caught into different facts or situations, and you want to find out more about them, and it's not. It's time consuming, especially when it's a dated crime like this.
Yeah.
Now, did you spend time trying to find out who Mr. Clutter was, and what about him would have been so alluring to kill, other than perhaps having a safe? Like, what would be the alternatives?
Clutter, one thing that Truman Capote touched on, and I think rather briefly, was that Herb Clutter was a very politically important individual. I found that he had been appointed by President Dwight Eisenhower to the Farm Credit Board, whose responsibility was to set farming price parity policies for the whole country. And Herb Clutter was also the founder and the member of both the National Kansas Wheat Association and the the National Wheat Association and the Kansas Wheat Association, among local co-ops and, of course, the church groups he was part of. But he was very politically powerful, and he had made, as many people do in politics, enemies in that world, one of whom was Ezra Taft Benson, the current Secretary of Agriculture, whose ideas for pricing were in opposition to Herb Clutter's. No?
Yeah, no, I was just, I didn't want to cut you
Sorry.
off. I didn't want to, if you were going to...
I wrapped up there, I think.
Yeah, I just... Okay. So, but do you think that what he was and what he did and his involvements would be enough to actually have him killed?
Oh, gosh, speculating like that is something I've tried to avoid, but I tend to think it was more related to the affair he might have been having, or clearly was having, rather. I'd probably rather not get into any more details about that, just out of respect for the family. But it could have either been that or the politics. But it's pretty clear that you don't kill 4 people for $50. I mean, this is the motive has always left the readers wondering if that was the real story. I think that's what stands out from anybody who leaves in cold blood, is why would 2 men do that for just $50?
Yeah.
Given the information I've found, it makes a little more sense.
Yeah. Well, they try to make it look like Perry was kind of had a rage, went insane, right?
Right. And I don't believe that happened at all. That brain explosion.
Yeah. Yeah, because they try to make it look like he was, having a meltdown over.
Right. It was a convenient device for the book.
Yeah. And
as Capote favored Perry Smith in his depiction of the killer throughout the book, it makes sense that would explain and somehow forgive his actions at the moment.
Yeah, give it a reason. Where do you see it going now? Like, what do you plan to do now with the information you have? Are you going to go further and do another book? Or are you going to pursue more on this case? Or are you?
I've thought about. I know so much more about Perry Smith and Richard Hickock than anyone who's read In Cold Blood. And if there is a demand for that material, I might go ahead and do a book on the 2 of them and bring in the psychology of their thinking.
Yeah, I think that would be a real interesting read, to kind of go through more about them and even their relationship with each other.
Yes, yeah. I think Capote covered that pretty well, but there's not much more on that I found in the materials. In both Hickock's letters, although they did want to kill each other, that's pretty clear. There were many times while they were on the road that they thought of offing each other as the only remaining witness against them, or because one was pissed off against the other, or whatever.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Now, have you heard from any of the remaining family members or anything about your book, or any feedback? No, not from the family at all. No, and of course the KBI and the Attorney General of Kansas, none of them comment on any of this at this point. No,
we did. They're furious now that we want attorney's fees.
Yeah.
But the court just redeemed this a pointless lawsuit, and there were portions of it that the state clearly was out of bounds on, and the court punished them by awarding some portion of attorney's fees against the massive bill that we had.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, it should. I think that's craziness how much effort they put into something that, if anything, would just reveal more about the case and more truth. So
right.
Why be so? It's not like there was not like anything suggestive about them doing something wrong in particular. So
right.
I'm confused, but
yeah, there are some materials still remaining in the KBI archives. One of those is an audio tape that I understand Richard Hickock and Perry Smith were together in a room talking, and they were being recorded without their knowledge. And I would give anything to hear what that was on that tape, and the KBI has chosen not to release it. And that's one of the reasons they dropped our lawsuit, I'm led to believe, is because there were two prongs in our lawsuit. One was, do we have the right to publish, which we did. The court ruled in our favor on that. And the other was, who owns the materials? Well, we were just about to go into that part of the lawsuit when the state had abruptly dropped the lawsuit because they knew that we would have rights of discovery to review any materials that still had on the case, and that included that audio tape.
Wow, that raises a lot of questions.
Sure does.
Because,
it sure does.
What would be on the tape? That I don't understand prosecutors and legal, departments trying to hide evidence after the fact like that when it would just tell you more of the truth. It's not.
Well, especially 60 years after the fact. And that may be why there's no interest in it. I mean, certainly the Attorney General of Kansas has a great deal to do.
Yeah.
Like any Attorney General, they're probably overwhelmed with work. So a 60-year-old case is not something they're likely to reopen for any reason.
Yeah, just craziness.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the book is available everywhere, Amazon and all fine bookstores.
It is indeed.
Do you have a website or a place that people can come find you?
I do, Al. Thanks. Yes, it's my name, GaryMcAvoy.com. And I'm on Facebook at Gary McAvoy Author.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.